Hello. I'm joined today by Faisal Devji, who's a professor of Indian history and a fellow of St. Anthony's College in the University of Oxford. He's also a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and Institute of Public Knowledge at New York University. It's a matter of great pleasure that he has joined all the way from Oxford. As we discussed earlier, today we are going to focus on the nature of protests across the globe, which started in the United States after the killing of George Floyd, but took a global character. It was an extraordinary moment where we saw many European capitals, as well as other parts of the world, protesting alongside with the American protesters. And this particular moment, Faisal, do you think that it holds a special significance or a meaning, given that the world is already trying to grapple with a global pandemic?
Yes, I do, Raza. In fact, I think those two things are linked. You know, the issue of racism, especially with the police, has been around for a long time in the United States, especially. But I think one reason why it went both national in the US and global in the rest of the West, and we can talk about why this movement has not moved beyond the West, has, I think, to do with the fact that uh, there was an inadvertent link with the pandemic. What was this link? One, of course, was the fact that so many people were at home and were, in quotes, free. These same people had not had any voice in the political events that surrounded the pandemic, because, of course, dealing with the pandemic is a political issue, not simply a medical issue. But ordinary people had been shut out for the most part of this set of events. And so I think the pandemic created a kind of opening, a portal, if you will, for people to humanize what was otherwise an inhuman event. And we have seen this kind of thing before. It's precisely because the pandemic was incalculable.
Right.
It was unpredicted, though it was not unpredictable, that allowed things to change so rapidly. And the protesters came out against racism at the very time when the pandemic was at its height, especially in the US, in the face of the state's greatest moment of authority, because no moment is as authoritative as one in which the state is dealing with a national emergency. And yet this is what happened.
Right. Yeah, that's really insightful. But do you remember any moments, in the past 2 or 3 decades, since we have embraced globalization, quote unquote? I mean, have there been similar moments of outrage or expression of a global solidarity uh, around an issue?
Yes, it's interesting when you put these protests in the context of a kind of global mobilizations. The pandemic itself did not give rise to such protests, right?
Yeah.
So even though the pandemic is global, it hasn't mobilized people on the streets in the way that anti-racism has. So when we look at the globalization or mobilization, I think the first event, and in a way it's a paradoxical event, is the so-called Rushdie affair of 1989, when Muslims came out onto the streets of British cities first, and then, of course, of cities in India and Pakistan, and elsewhere in the world, in the Muslim world particularly, against the alleged insults delivered to the Prophet in Rushdie's novel, The Satanic Verses. Now, you might look at these protests as being the first ones in which an ethnic minority, more or less discriminated against, came out in its own name in the West. And their mobilization was then mirrored for similar or different reasons elsewhere in the world. It's not necessarily the kind of genealogy we might like to create between Islam and Islamic protests on the one hand and anti-racism on the other, But nevertheless, I think it's a real link. And it's a real link not because of the ethnic minority or racial issues so much, as because these mobilizations have only become possible at the end of the Cold War. So the Rushdie affair is in 1989, in a way the climactic year of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the collapse of the Soviet Union, one of the things it does is it suddenly leaves the world without a kind of political or geopolitical order. There is no, what the controversial German jurist Carl Schmitt would have it, there is no nomos of the earth. There is no geopolitical order in place. And it is this lack of a geopolitical order that allows for the emergence of global arena in which these kinds of mobilizations for the first time become possible. And they, of course, become possible also due to technology and eventually social media that traverse this new arena. So if you see the Rushdie affair as the first one, and indeed it was the first global set of protests, the next ones along are quite different. You have the protests immediately after 9/11 against Al-Qaeda and in sympathy with the United States all over the world, including in places like Tehran, where you would not expect them to happen. Thirdly, the protests a few years later against the impending Iraq war. So there are a number of these sorts of mobilizations that have happened since the Rushdie affair and since the end of the Cold War, of which Black Lives Matter and Roads Must Fall in Britain, which together make up the anti-racism protests that we're seeing today, that's only the last set of global mobilizations. So I would place them all within a kind of post-Cold War scenario. They are not clearly linked by their content necessarily, though the theme of minoritization and minorityhood and of discrimination obviously rank very highly. And to these you might add finally, though they are not as global or in their mobilization, Extinction Rebellion and the Me Too, the gender protests, gender justice protests, Me Too. Those were not necessarily street protests. Extinction Rebellion were very highly theatrical forms of occupation of urban space. But Me Too tended to be much more social media oriented.
Correct. Yeah, that's exactly the case with Me Too and Extinction Rebellion. But certainly they had a global resonance. I mean, which is perhaps the common factor here. But I mean, do you think that these movements and the kind of solidarities we are witnessing will be able to sustain in the near future or in the distant future? Because I mean, if you look at the 20th century, there have been many attempts to forge international movements, international solidarities, but they were often victims of Cold War politics or national politics. But with the digital age that we live in now, with the social media, etc., where do you see this going?
Yeah, that's it's an interesting question. One thing I would like to say is that a number of things, unprecedented things, have changed already. The toppling of statues in the United States, especially, of course, is only one sign. The removing or the changing of names. Woodrow Wilson, for instance, has been removed from Princeton University, the Woodrow Wilson Center. Yeah. And of course, the huge amounts of money that are being shifted around. Facebook hit with boycotts from advertisers because of its tolerance of hate-related content, which is not all about race, but in large part it might be. And then, of course, the funneling of money towards racial diversity causes as well. So all of these things are unprecedented. No one could have imagined that they would happen. So something already has changed. Now, whether there'll be any continuity is another question, of course. I suspect that what's happening here is a kind of moment of refounding in a way. There are two moments, I think. One has to do with the revival of apparently moribund causes. You know, when you look at a prior regional mobilization, like the Arab Spring, which I haven't mentioned previously, here, what do you have? For the Arab Spring, you have a set of protests and uprisings and mobilizations across a region, the Arab world, which have no obvious links to one another, right? They're not being planned by any central casting. They imitate each other in the same way that these protests over Muhammad and blasphemy and Islam, etc., used to imitate each other. There was not necessarily very much planning in them. So they are following that very media-friendly, highly technologized model on the one hand. On the other hand, what you see happening with the Arab Spring as a regional mobilization is the reemergence of moribund identities. So no one imagined that Arab nationalism was actually a thing any longer. It had just become so sclerotic and so rigid and so in the ownership and possession of nation states that people imagined that this was no longer a popular movement of the kind it might have been at the 1950s. And yet, without even using the name Arab nationalism, these mobilizations occurred only in that part of the world where Arab nationalism had once been a reality. Now, I think what you're seeing with race today, it too, we call it a global movement, and of course it is in some ways, but it doesn't really go much beyond the West, in quotation marks. Yeah. And there are reasons for that, which we can discuss. There too, identities like white supremacy or even racial minoritization and discrimination, which were imagined to have been problems that were in the past, that had been either resolved completely or were in the process of being solved. They were not real issues. They were only marginal issues. These have come back from the dead, as it were. And I think, it's a fascinating thing that's happening. So on the one hand, that. On the other hand, what I'm calling the moment of refounding. The focus of these movements, the anti-race movements, on statuary, on symbols, I think is a way of addressing the question, which is a genuine political question of how do you refound? How do you lay new foundations for a polity? And of course, statuary especially and names are the most effective symbolic ways in which you can describe or signal the definition or the identity of any country or national ideology or political ideology or civilization or what you have it. So the toppling of statues, I think, might be seen as a form of an attempt to refound our polity, not simply at the national level, but at the regional and indeed even at the global level. Where that will take us, of course, is an open question, though I have my views on it.
Okay, yes, exactly. I mean, the refounding is very interesting because I think in the case of the US, particularly, the imagination of a nation state is under scrutiny and intense questioning now. I mean, the names and the symbols. I mean, it's not a small thing that Woodrow Wilson Center name has been taken out all of a sudden from a very prestigious university where it was a given. It was like the norm, I suppose. So, I mean, and the interesting question then arises, the location of these movements in Western Europe, in the West. And there have been some flashes in Latin America too, but not as widespread as one would have thought, because, I mean, Brazil has a race issue as well. I mean, so many other countries. And India, for example, a huge country with caste and other divisions, which kind of mirror the racial inequalities. So why do you think that India, Pakistan, I mean, these big swathes of population have not been as involved or engaged in this global moment?
Well, in a place like India, only very recently we saw quite extensive and equally unprecedented uprisings or struggles or mobilizations, whichever word you fancy, over the Citizenship Amendment Act
Hmm.
and the proposed National Register of Citizens, which was understood by those protesting as being discriminatory against Muslims and other religious minorities in particular. Uh, that mobilization was nationwide. It was extraordinary, and it intersected here and there with anti-caste protests, which of course have a much longer history in India. So there is something already happening in India. It has been happening. It's been damped down forcibly by the pandemic and by the dispersal of protests in Indian cities. But I think in a place like India, and indeed I would say Pakistan as well, caste should and will be a major um, focus for protest. And we tend not to think about caste when we think about Pakistan, but of course it's an increasingly important um, cleavage. Um, and it is one that is often disguised by religious terms. Uh, so, often it is people who are understood as having been converted from low castes to other minority religions in Pakistan. Those are the people who are being attacked.
Mm.
But when they are being attacked, they are attacked as much in terms of their caste as in terms of their religion. And we shouldn't try to sequester caste religiously either, because it exists among Muslims as it does among other religious groups. So I would think, or at least I would like to think, that if there is a pan-South Asian movement of protest for justice, one of the ways in which it would express itself is through caste, because caste is something that runs across every South Asian country. It cannot simply be located in India or within Hinduism.
Yeah, and it's commonly experienced and lived reality. I mean, so let's hope we get there. So, coming back to the West, so this whole, defund the police or restructure the police or abolish it, there are all sorts of slogans here in the US, especially. Uh, and interestingly, the police structures, I mean, in the US in particular, are very imperial in nature. I mean, they go date back to the slavery era, and there's a whole quest for decolonization and a theme which underwrites these protests as well. And as a professor of history, I'm very curious to know, because we often think of decolonization, I being a Pakistani, in our sort of context of the British leaving us and we want to change the police. But, here many of the Western countries also need to perhaps decolonize themselves. Or I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Clearly the way the police violence in the United States, is almost entirely different from police violence in Western Europe. Its occurrence in the United States and its racialization is much greater. Though, of course, I would argue that in the United States, there's also much greater racial diversity in police forces. So it's interesting that way. So, policing in the US, a country which has so many more guns than any Western European one, in which there's so many more shootings, in which so many more people die in police firing than do in the whole of Western Europe combined. These two things should not be comparable. And indeed, in the UK, especially, the protests have not focused on the police so much. The anti-race protests. Not to say that the police are entirely innocent, or that people see them as being innocent, but they are not the chief target. The target has been institutional racism, including in the police, statuary and symbols, etc.
Yes. I mean, I think that's a fair point. So my final question would be that this whole future. I mean, obviously, um, in the U.S. at least, there is a some level of cautious optimism with all these protests. Changing the discourse and the political landscape, as well as police reform, because now the bills upon bills are being tabled in the Congress, and senators are working on different proposals. But my concern here is that how do we think of a future which is more globalized in terms of a political consciousness and struggle, because we do have people like President Trump here who don't believe in globalization or international action. And would you also consider that these protests are kind of a reaction to uh, that particular worldview?
Yeah, I mean, you know what I was saying earlier about the Arab Spring and the revival of what everyone had thought of were moribund or marginal identities and politics. I mean, you see at the moment, and the American president is at the forefront of this, at the moment of the greatest crisis of the West institutionally. And I don't only refer to the pandemic here. There's Brexit.
Yeah.
There's the United States' withdrawal from its allies, and from various kinds of treaties that have linked it with its allies against Russia, for instance. The crisis of the EU, the crisis of NATO. At this very moment of greatest institutional crisis, what you have is the re-emergence of the West, because this is where the protests are occurring. That really is a moment of refounding, but it's a refounding, if you will, of the West. I don't have any better name for it at the moment. A refounding of the West against its own past in the cause of justice, and not through a set of inherited institutions. So it's not simply the protesters saying, look, we disagree with President Trump and we would rather have the old NAFTA, and we would rather not have Brexit, and we would rather have a fulsome NATO, and they're not going back to the Cold War verities. These are all of these are Cold War institutions. And in a way, you can understand why they're now falling. They too are the casualties of the post-Cold War period. What they are saying instead is we're going to refound the West in a different way. At the moment, new institutions have not been put in place, and maybe they never will. But something very interesting is happening in the mobilization, just as it had during the Arab Spring, where all of these disconnected protests imitated each other to produce something which everyone had thought was dead. And indeed, I would like to suggest that the roots of this, what Schmitt would have called a global civil war, he defined a global civil war in class terms. He thought that the founding of the Soviet Union made possible a global civil war between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie all over the world. That did not come to pass because the Cold War world actually was a world of order, hostile order. It is now that we don't have an order, and the global civil war with us now doesn't have a single enemy or a single set of rivals, but it's dispersed and occurs in many different parts of the world. And you see it in Islamic militancy all over the world. You also see it in racist and anti-race movements. You see it in environmental movements and those corporate interests that are against it. You see it all over the place. And if I were to give a date to it in a way, I would give the date 1971, because 1971, the independence of Bangladesh, signals one of the earliest moments when the state system coming into being, Bangladesh in particular, was no longer a post-colonial form of political emergence. From 1947 until 1971, give or take some years, you have the emergence of a large number of countries that are post-colonial countries that emerge out of colonialism and colonization. With Bangladesh, Bangladesh emerges against the post-colonial state, against Pakistan. It does not emerge against the British Empire. And its history is not linked to the history of the British Empire. The British Empire in 1947 are of no concern in Bangladeshi textbooks. It's very interesting. Right?
Yes.
So in a way, 1971 signals the end of the post-colonial state. Not the end of the state, the end of the emergence of this global form of polity. And Bangladesh, of course, emerges in a civil war, the Pakistani civil war. And since 1971, what we see is not so much wars between countries. Indeed, 71 was the last time India and Pakistan went to war formally, but wars within countries. And it is these series of wars with many outside participants that build up into what I'm calling a global civil war that signals both the end, especially after the Cold War, the end of a global order and a moment of transition, perhaps one that can be extended quite far into the future, that might herald the coming of a new order.
Very interesting, Faisal. These are really insightful remarks, and you know, they've opened windows and possibilities of picking up on so many themes in our future conversations. So thank you so much for the time today. I hope all the viewers would benefit from the most profound sense of history and historical readings that Dr. Faisal Devji has brought for us. So goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.